Welcome back. If you want me to keep telling these stories, stick around for more. It started as a perfect evening in the wilderness. We were camping by a secluded lake in New Mexico, far from any major towns or noise. The stillness of nature surrounded us, and the only sounds we heard were the crackling of the campfire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. The group, a mix of family and friends, was in high spirits, enjoying the simplicity of the moment, roasting marshmallows, swapping funny stories, and indulging in the kind of relaxation that only comes when you're disconnected from the world. The sky was inky black, filled with stars that seemed close enough to touch, and the night air was cool, adding to the sense of tranquility. It was one of those moments where you feel completely at peace, as if nothing could possibly disturb the calm. The neighboring group of 6 campers, though a short distance away, blended into the background, their murmurs and laughter creating a soft, distant hum. Then, almost too quietly at first, we heard it, an eerie, high-pitched voice cutting through the stillness. A little girl's voice, unmistakable and filled with desperation, calling out for help. The sound was so out of place in this remote setting that, for a brief moment, we all froze, uncertain if we had really heard it. But the voice came again, more urgent this time, sending a chill through the group. The night that had felt so serene now carried a strange, unsettling tension, as if the peaceful atmosphere had been disrupted by something unnatural lurking just beyond the firelight. Determined to find the source of the mysterious cries, we gathered flashlights and cautiously ventured toward the field behind our campsites, where the sound seemed to be coming from. The air felt heavier now, and each step we took felt like wading into an unknown danger. The dim beams of our flashlights barely pierced the thick darkness ahead of us, casting long shadows that twisted and flickered ominously. As we moved further into the open field, an eerie silence fell over the night, so quiet that even the usual chorus of crickets had ceased. The only thing that remained was the faint, distant cry of the little girl, as if she was leading us deeper into the unknown. Then we saw it. Standing still about 100 feet away, bathed in the soft glow of moonlight, was a figure. It was shockingly tall, unnaturally slender, and unnervingly white, as though it didn't belong in the natural world. Its form was human-like, but distorted, too thin, too pale, like a ghost or something not quite alive. There was no clear face, no distinguishable features, just an unsettling silhouette that seemed to shimmer faintly in the night. Its pure white body contrasted starkly against the dark backdrop of the trees behind it, making it impossible to ignore. We stood frozen, our group exchanging nervous glances. The figure didn't move at first, but the eerie cries continued, sounding as though they came from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was impossible to tell if the sound came from the figure itself or the woods surrounding it. A creeping sense of dread washed over us as we realized this figure was the source of the calls. Gathering what courage we had, we decided to move closer. But as we took a few steps forward, the figure began to back away. Slowly, deliberately, it retreated toward the trees at the edge of the field, almost as if it was leading us somewhere. But before we could follow it any further, it vanished, disappearing into the thick shadows of the forest without making a sound. One moment it was there, and the next it was swallowed by the darkness, leaving us standing in the field, unsure of what we had just encountered. The unsettling cries, however, did not vanish with it. They lingered in the air, making the hair on the back of our necks stand up, as if the presence had never truly left. After the strange figure vanished into the trees, we stood in stunned silence, unsure of what to do next. The night, which had once been filled with the comforting glow of our campfires and the warmth of shared laughter, now felt oppressive, thick with an unsettling energy. The sound of the little girl's voice still echoed faintly through the air, as if it were surrounding us, coming from all directions at once. There was no logical explanation for what we had seen or heard, but we knew one thing for certain: whatever it was, it didn't feel natural. We retreated back to our campsites, but the sense of safety we had felt earlier was long gone. Every shadow seemed darker, every rustle in the leaves more sinister. Even the familiar sounds of the forest, branches swaying in the wind, the occasional hoot of an owl, felt ominous, as if the night itself was watching us. Despite being surrounded by others, there was an overwhelming feeling of isolation, like we had been cut off from the rest of the world. The soft murmur of conversation that once filled the air had quieted, replaced by nervous whispers and stolen glances toward the dark edge of the trees. As the hours stretched on, the cries continued sporadically, distant yet clear enough to send a chill down our spines. Each time we heard it, it felt like the voice was closer, though when we shone our flashlights into the darkness, there was nothing to be seen. Sleep was out of the question. We lay in our tents, wide-eyed, straining to hear the faintest sound, half expecting the tall figure to reappear at any moment. The fabric of the tents felt paper-thin, offering no protection from whatever might be lurking outside. Every creak of the forest, every gust of wind set our hearts racing, making it impossible to relax. As the night dragged on, the eerie calls of the little girl slowly began to fade, but the fear they instilled in us remained. Even as dawn finally broke, casting the forest in a soft, forgiving light, the memories of the night before lingered heavily. None of us could shake the feeling that something had been watching us, something beyond our understanding. We packed up camp that morning in a quiet, hurried rush, exchanging few words, all too aware that the eerie stillness of the previous night might return. Though the figure and the cries had disappeared with the darkness, the experience left us with a lingering unease, an unshakable sense that we had encountered something we were never meant to. It was one of those long, endless nights on the road. The kind where the darkness seems to stretch on forever and the hum of the tires on the asphalt becomes hypnotic. My mom, sister, and I had been driving for hours, making our way across the country. I was 16 at the time, and my sister was 20. Despite the late hour, none of us felt tired. The kind of adrenaline that comes from being on the road for days kept us alert. We were deep in a remote stretch of interstate, miles from the nearest town, when we realized we needed to stop for gas and take a bathroom break. There was only one rest stop within a 200-mile radius, and as luck would have it, we spotted the dim lights of a gas station in the distance. At first glance, it looked like any other lonely rest stop in the middle of nowhere. The flickering neon sign cast a pale glow over the station, and aside from a van full of teenagers and a small gray car at the pump in front of us, the place was deserted. But the moment we pulled in, something felt off. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a gut feeling that gnawed at me, a subtle but undeniable sense that something was wrong. The air felt heavier, thicker somehow, like the quiet night was pressing in on us. My mom and sister decided to head inside to use the bathroom while I stayed in the car, keeping an eye on things. As I sat there, I noticed the van full of teenagers. They were standing around the pump, but something in their behavior was off. They were visibly uneasy, muttering to each other, fidgeting nervously as if they sensed the same strange energy I did. They couldn't get the gas pump to work, and without any further hesitation, piled back into their van and left in a hurry. That's when I really started to pay attention to the small gray car in front of us. Two men stood next to it, completely motionless. They weren't talking or checking their phones. They just stood there, frozen, not even glancing in our direction, their silence and stillness heightening the growing sense of unease. The whole scene felt wrong, like the air itself was charged with something ominous, something waiting just beyond our understanding. As I sat in the car, my unease deepened. There was something disturbingly unnatural about the scene unfolding in front of me. The two men by the gray car hadn't moved, not even a shift of weight or a casual glance around the gas station. They stood there as if frozen in time, their faces turned slightly away from me, their bodies unnervingly still. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, even though their backs were to me. It was as if their presence wasn't just physical. It felt looming, oppressive, like they were silently exerting some kind of invisible force over the space around them. My attention flickered to the van full of teenagers, who were growing more frantic by the second. They were huddled together near the pump, whispering urgently, their hands fumbling with the gas nozzle. Even from inside the car, I could see their nervous glances darting toward the gray car, just as aware of its eerie stillness as I was. One of them tried the pump again, but after a few failed attempts, They hurriedly got back into their van and sped off, tires screeching as they disappeared into the night. Their sudden departure left the station unnervingly quiet, amplifying the bizarre stillness of the two men in front of me. Just as I was contemplating honking the horn to alert my mom and sister inside, the station doors flew open, and they came running back to the car. Both of them looked pale, their faces tense with fear, like they had seen something I hadn't. They didn't say a word as they scrambled into the car, slamming the doors shut. Before I could ask what had happened, something even stranger occurred. The two men, who had been standing stock still the entire time, slowly turned their heads to look at us, without moving their bodies. Their movements were deliberate, almost robotic, their necks twisting unnaturally as they fixed their gaze on our car. My heart pounded in my chest as their faces came into view. What we saw defied explanation. Their eyes weren't just dark, they were empty. Pitch-black voids, not reflecting any light, not even the glimmer of the dim gas station bulbs. They weren't just devoid of emotion or expression. They were devoid of everything. It was as though we were staring into nothingness, a hollow absence of life where eyes should have been. Time seemed to slow as we locked eyes with them, or whatever they were. An overwhelming sense of dread filled the car, thickening the air around us. It was as if those empty eyes were drawing us in, pulling us towards some unfathomable darkness. My mom turned the key in the ignition, hands shaking, and we tore out of the gas station, tires screeching as we fled down the empty highway. None of us spoke for miles, but the eerie image of those men and their impossible eyes stayed with us, a chilling reminder of whatever it was we had just encountered. As we sped down the highway, leaving the unsettling gas station far behind, an eerie silence hung in the car. My mom gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white, while my sister sat motionless in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead, eyes wide with lingering fear. I sat in the back, still trying to make sense of what we had just seen. My mind raced, replaying the image of those men, if you could call them men, standing like statues, their empty, void-like eyes boring into us. It felt unreal, like a scene from a nightmare we couldn't wake from. Yet, it had been all too real. We drove in silence for what felt like hours, none of us daring to break the spell of dread that had settled over the car. Finally, when the lights of the next city appeared on the horizon, we slowed down and pulled into a well-lit parking lot, just to catch our breath. It was only then that we started to talk, to share what we had all seen. My mom and sister had felt the same suffocating wrongness inside the gas station, an overwhelming sense that they weren't safe, that they needed to get out as quickly as possible. But it wasn't until we discussed the two men that we realized we had all seen the same thing. Their unnervingly still bodies and those impossible black, empty eyes. Desperate to make sense of what had happened, we pulled out our phones and started looking up the rest stop on Google Maps, wanting to understand where exactly we had been. After all, it had been the only place to stop for miles, a strange beacon of light in an otherwise desolate stretch of road. But no matter how much we searched, the rest stop wasn't there. Confused, we tried everything, zooming in on the exact stretch of interstate, pulling out the old paper maps we had in the car, but the gas station simply didn't exist. We were certain of where it should have been. We'd driven the same route before, and we knew the landscape well enough. There should have been a small rest stop exactly where we had stopped, but there was nothing. The maps showed only barren stretches of highway and empty land. We even asked locals once we got to the city, hoping someone could explain the strange gas station we had encountered. Every time we described the place, the confused looks we received only deepened the mystery. No one had ever heard of a gas station on that stretch of road. The next time we drove that same interstate, we made a point of watching for the rest stop. We passed the exact spot where it should have been. But there was nothing, just empty highway. No sign of the gas station, the pumps, or the eerie figures we had seen that night. It was as if the entire place had been wiped from existence, as if it had never been there in the first place. To this day, we still can't explain what happened, or how a place that had felt so real, so terrifyingly real, could simply vanish. The memory of those dark, empty eyes and the creeping dread that had filled the air stays with us. a chilling reminder that some things on the road can't be explained. My junior year of college, I found myself living in the oldest dormitory on campus, a place steeped in history, its worn stone facade and creaky wooden floors bearing the weight of generations of students. Naturally, a building like this came with its fair share of ghost stories. Every upperclassman had heard them, passed down like a rite of passage. Strange noises late at night, shadowy figures in the hallways, doors that closed on their own. But for the most part, these tales were harmless, the kind of spooky campus lore that added a bit of charm to an otherwise normal college experience. The basement, however, was a different story. It wasn't part of the usual ghost tales, but everyone agreed it was unsettling. The space was unfinished, with cold cement walls and a bare concrete floor that seemed almost damp, despite the fact it hadn't rained in weeks. Old, dim lights hung from the ceiling, casting long shadows that made the already creepy space feel claustrophobic. Cobwebs clung to the corners, untouched for who knows how long. The laundry machines were down there, and though it was practical, everyone tried to avoid doing laundry late at night. There was something about being alone in that dim, echoing basement that felt wrong, like the shadows were too dark, too thick, as if they were hiding something you didn't want to see. In one corner of the basement, tucked away where few ventured, was a door. It was small and unassuming, with peeling paint and a rusted lock. It didn't look like it led to anything important, probably just a utility closet, or so I thought. But the longer I lived in that dorm, the more I became fixated on that door. What could possibly be behind it? It was too small to lead anywhere significant, and yet it was always locked. No one ever went in, and no one seemed to know what was behind it. As the semester went on, curiosity got the better of me. I had always had a knack for exploring, and even picking a few locks here and there for fun. I tried my luck with this door many times, but no matter what I did, it wouldn't budge. It became a kind of obsession. This simple, unremarkable door that refused to open, as if it was hiding something it didn't want me to find. The basement itself felt like it held secrets. You could almost feel it when you stood down there alone, the weight of the air pressing in on you, making your skin prickle. Every time I was down there, the locked door seemed to loom larger in my mind, an unsolvable puzzle that nagged at me. I asked around, trying to find someone who knew what was behind it, but no one had ever seen it open. It seemed like one of those forgotten corners of an old building, abandoned and left to collect dust, except this one had a lock that resisted every attempt to open it. The more I failed to unlock it, the more my curiosity grew, and the more the basement began to feel like a place I shouldn't linger in, especially when I was alone. It was one of those nights where everything seemed to align against me. After weeks of burning the midnight oil, juggling assignments, and barely getting any sleep, I had finally finished my work early and was looking forward to a rare, much-needed night of rest. The exhaustion had built up, and the thought of sinking into bed at a reasonable hour felt like a reward. But as luck would have it, just when I thought I'd have a peaceful night, the universe had other plans. A friend called me unexpectedly, needing to talk through a personal problem, and being the good friend I am, I headed out to meet them. Then, just as I was about to return to the dorm, another friend called. By the time I got off the phone with them, it was after midnight, and I was feeling mentally drained. Finally, a third message popped up on my phone. Another friend, another problem. I'm not usually the type to thrive in social situations, so the emotional toll of helping 3 friends in one night after days of little sleep had me on edge. I was happy to help, but the strange coincidence of it happening all in one night was starting to get to me. By the time I was walking back to my dorm at 2:30 a.m., all I could think about was collapsing into bed. The campus was unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like the world is holding its breath. The night was still, with only the distant hum of streetlights and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. As I reached the entrance to the dorm and fumbled with my keys to unlock the door, a strange feeling crept over me. It started as a faint tingle at the back of my neck, the kind of sensation you get when you feel someone watching you, even though you know you're alone. It wasn't fear exactly, but it was enough to make me pause. Then, out of nowhere, I felt a strange compulsion, a pull, almost like a whisper in the back of my mind. Something was telling me to go down to the basement. At first I dismissed it, thinking maybe I had laundry still in the wash, but that wasn't it. It wasn't just a fleeting thought. It was a persistent urge, almost as if a voice was softly but clearly saying, "Come down to the basement." I stood there, keys in hand, staring at the stairs that led down to the basement. I couldn't shake the feeling. It wasn't fear that gripped me. It was something else, something harder to explain. The best way I can describe it is that it felt like I needed to go down there, as if there was something waiting for me. Oddly enough, I wasn't scared. Instead, I felt almost excited, as if this was something I had to do. It was like when you have a gut feeling that tells you where you need to be, and in this moment, it felt like the basement was calling me. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I'd forgotten something, or maybe it was just exhaustion playing tricks on me. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each second. It reminded me of that scene in Harry Potter, when Harry drinks Felix Felicis and suddenly feels like everything is falling into place, guiding him where he needs to go. That's exactly how it felt, like I was being led, and all I had to do was follow. The prickling at the back of my neck intensified, and I swear I could almost hear the words in my mind again. Just go down for a moment. Against my better judgment, I gave in to the pull. It didn't make any sense, but I turned and made my way down the stairs into the basement. The stairwell was dimly lit, casting long, unsettling shadows on the walls as I descended. When I reached the bottom, I flicked on the light switch, flooding the room with the harsh glow of the old fluorescent bulbs. The basement was as it always was, empty, silent, the laundry machines dormant. There was no one there. Yet, despite the stillness, that strange pull hadn't let go of me. It was as if I was waiting for something, standing in the middle of the cold cement floor, feeling ridiculous, but oddly compelled to stay. I stood there for a moment, looking around, expecting something to happen, but nothing did. The place was as ordinary as ever, and I started to feel foolish. Maybe it was just the stress and lack of sleep playing with my mind. But just as I was about to turn and head back upstairs, something caught my eye. The locked door. The same door I had tried countless times to open was now wide open, standing there like it had been waiting for me all along. As I turned to leave the basement, my eyes caught something that stopped me in my tracks. The locked door, the one that had always resisted every attempt to open, was now standing wide open. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. The door had been locked tight for as long as I could remember, a constant, mysterious fixture in the basement that no one seemed to know anything about. Now, in the eerie silence of the night, it stood ajar, as if inviting me inside. The pull I had felt earlier, the strange urge to come down to the basement, suddenly made sense. It had all led to this moment. I hesitated, staring at the dark gap beyond the door. I was half expecting something, someone, to emerge, but the room beyond was still, silent. My curiosity, which had been simmering for months, pushed me forward. I moved cautiously toward the door, my footsteps echoing unnervingly in the empty basement. As I approached, the light from the overhead bulbs barely penetrated the small space beyond the door. The room was much smaller than I had imagined, barely bigger than a closet. There was something profoundly wrong about it, though. Despite its size, it felt suffocating, like the air was thicker inside, the temperature slightly colder. I stepped closer, peering into the dimly lit room. At first glance, it seemed almost empty, except for two strange, out-of-place objects. A small, worn desk, the kind you might find in an old elementary school, and an equally battered computer chair, the kind that spins. The desk was pushed up against the wall, directly beneath a single, bare light bulb that hung from the ceiling on a frayed cord. The bulb flickered slightly, casting uneven, weak light over the room, making the shadows dance unnervingly. But what caught my attention, what truly sent a chill down my spine, was the chair. The old, ragged computer chair was spinning. Slowly, steadily, it rotated in place, its movement too controlled to be caused by a draft. The basement had always been still, with no windows or airflow strong enough to set something spinning like that. There was no explanation. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was someone in the room moments before I arrived? Had someone left it spinning? But there was no one else in the basement, and no way to explain why it continued to spin so smoothly. The longer I stood there, the more the room felt wrong, like it didn't belong in the normal world. The sight of the spinning chair, illuminated by the flickering light bulb, was unnerving in a way I couldn't explain. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to turn and run, but I found myself frozen, caught between curiosity and fear. The room seemed to hum with an energy I couldn't understand, as if it was holding on to a secret too dark to uncover. The chair kept spinning, a slow, deliberate motion that defied any explanation. Finally, the tension broke, and my body responded to the overwhelming sense of dread that had taken hold. Without thinking, I turned and bolted, my footsteps echoing unnervingly as I sprinted up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I reached my dorm room 3 floors up. I slammed the door behind me, locking it as if that could somehow keep the strange energy of the basement at bay. I jumped into bed, pulling the covers over my head like a frightened child, trying to calm my racing thoughts. After that night, I never returned to the basement alone. I never tried to pick the lock on that door again, even in the safety of daylight. I asked around casually, trying to see if anyone else had ever seen the door open or knew anything about the strange room beyond it, but no one had. It was as if the door, the desk, the spinning chair, all of it, was a secret only I had stumbled upon. The door remained locked after that night, and no matter how many times I passed by, I never saw it open again. Yet the memory of that spinning chair, that eerie, out-of-place desk, stayed with me, a reminder of something unsettling just beneath the surface of normalcy. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that I had been too eager to obey the call to the basement, too willing to follow a pull that I didn't fully understand. For years I had grown accustomed to the eerie quiet of night shifts in residential care facilities, but working the overnight shift in a soul-charged dementia facility was different. It was a facility with 15 residents, each at varying stages of dementia, and I was the only one on duty during the night. The responsibility was heavy, and the nights were long, filled with strange sounds and quiet corridors that felt endless in the dim light. There were no other staff members to rely on, no quick relief from the isolation, just me, 15 residents, and the building that sometimes felt like it had its own presence in the silence of the early morning hours. The facility was secure, or so I thought. Locked doors, alarms, and security measures gave a sense of protection, but on night shifts, that sense of safety often felt thin. Every creak of the old building, every hum of a machine, and every restless rustle from the residents' rooms heightened my senses. Around 3 a.m., the night was at its stillest. This was the time when the rest of the world felt like it had paused, leaving only me and the quiet ticking of the clock. It was during this time that I completed my intentional rounds, carefully checking on each resident, making sure they were safe, breathing easily, and still in bed. It was a routine I knew well, but each night had its own small unpredictabilities. Some nights were quiet, but others could take unexpected turns. After my round, I returned to my station, settling back into the usual quiet. I had just started to relax when the doorbell rang. The sound shattered the silence, echoing through the empty corridors. My heart jumped in my chest. A sudden wave of goosebumps washed over me, and a knot of anxiety formed in my stomach. The doorbell ringing in the middle of the night made no sense. The facility was locked down. No one should be able to access the door without staff assistance, especially at this hour. Visitors were unheard of at this time, and the thought of someone being at the door sent a chill down my spine. I hesitated, unsure whether I should check the door. Gathering my nerves, I peeked out the window near the front entrance. The parking lot was dimly lit by streetlights, and I scanned the area, but no one was there. The front door was empty, just the same quiet darkness as always. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Maybe I had imagined it, an auditory illusion brought on by the quiet of the night and my own exhaustion. Or maybe the doorbell had malfunctioned. Trying to brush off the unsettling feeling, I returned to my post, convincing myself it was nothing to worry about. But that eerie sense of wrongness lingered in the air. Something didn't feel right, and as much as I tried to ignore it, The tension in the air remained, like an invisible weight pressing down on me. Just as I was beginning to settle back into my seat and regain some composure, it happened again. The doorbell rang. This time, the sound was sharper, more insistent, slicing through the stillness like a knife. My heart rate spiked, and a cold sweat broke out across my skin. This wasn't just a faulty bell or my imagination playing tricks on me. Someone or something was out there. The realization sent a fresh wave of anxiety coursing through me. Every horror story I'd ever heard about working the night shift came rushing back, and I suddenly felt more alone than ever in that quiet, dark facility. I stood up and approached the window again, my hands trembling slightly as I peeked through the blinds, scanning the entrance for any sign of movement. But once again, the door was empty. No shadow, no figure standing at the threshold, just the stillness of the night. This time, however, something caught my eye. Across the street, parked in the shadow of a large tree, was a strange car I hadn't noticed before. Its headlights were off, and the vehicle sat ominously still, as if watching. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled with unease. I quickly grabbed my phone and snapped a picture of the car, thinking it might be useful later, just in case. The oddness of the situation was growing with every minute, and I didn't want to dismiss anything as a coincidence. Trying to calm myself, I returned to my station where one of the residents, an elderly lady with advanced dementia, was still sitting nearby. She was sweet, though often confused, prone to speaking to people who weren't there, and drifting in and out of moments that seemed to exist only in her mind. We had been playing a simple card game before the doorbell interruptions, trying to keep her occupied. As I sat down, attempting to shake off the unease, she looked at me with a peculiar expression, her eyes filled with a knowing calm that didn't match her usual demeanor. "What did the gentleman want, dearie?" she asked softly, her voice a raspy whisper. "He looked like he had a bad night. Probably needs a nice cup of tea." Her words sent a cold, electric shock through my body. I stared at her, my mind racing. No one had come to the door, at least no one that I had seen. Yet here she was, speaking as if she had seen someone, her tone so casual, so matter-of-fact, that it was unnerving. I tried to dismiss it, rationalizing that it was just part of her condition. Hallucinations and confusion were common in dementia patients, after all. She often spoke about things that weren't real, things that only she could see or hear. But the timing, right after the doorbell had rung twice, and after seeing the strange car, made my skin crawl. I tried to shake off the feeling, but the unease clung to me like a shadow. Just when I thought I had calmed myself enough to continue my work, the doorbell rang again, this time even louder, more urgent, like a demand for attention. My nerves were completely shot by now. Every instinct in my body screamed that something was wrong, that I shouldn't ignore it, but also that I shouldn't confront it. I was alone, vulnerable, and responsible for 15 residents, many of whom were in no state to defend themselves if something or someone was outside trying to get in. As I made my way back to the window for a third time, I passed another resident. He was wandering the hallway, one of his usual nighttime habits. To keep him occupied, we had given him a clean paintbrush, and he often spent his time painting the air and walls, lost in his own world. As I walked by him, he paused, lowering his brush and looking at me with a seriousness that stopped me in my tracks. "Don't answer the door alone," he said softly, his voice eerily calm. "He might hurt you." My blood turned to ice. How could he know what was happening? How could he possibly sense the same dread that was building inside me? He simply turned away and continued his silent painting, leaving me standing there, heart pounding, pulse racing. This was no ordinary night shift. Something was out there, and I was all alone. A 23-year-old woman in charge of 15 vulnerable people with nowhere to turn. The panic rose in my chest as I slowly approached the window again, terrified of what I might see next. With my heart pounding and every nerve in my body on high alert, I approached the window one final time, each step feeling heavier than the last. I could barely breathe, and the dim lighting of the hallway seemed to press in on me, making everything feel more claustrophobic. When I reached the window, I cautiously pulled back the blinds, half expecting nothing, just the empty parking lot and the strange car still parked across the street. But as my eyes adjusted to the dark outside, my worst fear materialized. There, in the shadows, I saw movement. A figure stepped out from behind the corner of the building and walked directly toward the window where I stood, as if they had been waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. My breath caught in my throat as the figure came into view, their movements slow but deliberate. I froze, unable to tear my eyes away as the person stepped closer and closer to the front of the facility, until they were just inches from the glass, directly in front of me. Our eyes met through the window, and in that split second, I felt a jolt of raw terror shoot through me. He was a man, his face gaunt and pale in the dim light, eyes wide and filled with a strange, almost manic intensity. His clothes were disheveled, and his expression was unreadable, neither angry nor friendly, just disturbingly vacant. But what terrified me most was the way he seemed to know I was there, as if he had been expecting me, waiting for me to look out that window. I screamed, a sharp, uncontrollable sound that echoed through the quiet halls of the facility. My heart was racing, my body shaking with fear. The man, startled by my reaction, suddenly bolted, running out of view and disappearing into the darkness. I backed away from the window, breathless and panicked, as the commotion quickly spread through the building. My scream had woken several of the residents, and now the once quiet facility was filled with the confused voices of the elderly, some of them frightened by the noise, others simply disoriented by being woken from their sleep. I could hear doors opening, residents shuffling into the hallways, their soft voices filled with confusion, asking what was going on. The surreal, quiet atmosphere of the night shift had shattered into chaos, and I was at the center of it, struggling to maintain control. Desperate, I grabbed the phone and dialed the police, my hands shaking as I explained what had just happened. I tried calling my on-call supervisor, but as I had expected, there was no answer. It was the weekend, and she never answered on weekends, leaving me completely alone to deal with the situation. By the time the police arrived, the facility was in disarray. Residents were wandering the halls, some scared, some agitated, asking me repeatedly what was happening, while others simply stood in confusion, not fully aware of the situation. The officers arrived quickly, their flashing lights casting a blue and red glow across the walls. 2 policemen entered the building, trying their best to reassure the residents, but the presence of strangers only made things more chaotic. Some of the residents, already prone to paranoia and confusion, grew agitated by the sight of the uniforms and the disturbance to their nightly routine. It was chaos trying to settle them down while explaining the events to the officers. I showed the police the photo I had taken of the strange car parked across the street, which was still there, empty now. I recounted the events, the doorbell ringing, the strange car, the man who had looked in the window. The police officers took notes and asked questions, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. They reassured me that they would search the area for any suspicious activity, but without much more to go on, I could tell they weren't sure what to make of the situation. All I could do was hope they would find something, or someone, that would explain the terror of the past few hours. By the time the situation had calmed down, it was already morning. The sky outside had turned a pale gray as dawn approached, and the night shift was nearly over. The residents, after several cups of tea and some calming medication, were finally settled again. I was physically and emotionally exhausted, barely holding myself together as the morning nurse and caregiver arrived for handover. I explained everything to them, from the eerie doorbell to the man at the window, trying to keep my voice steady despite the lingering fear. That's when they told me something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up once again. Apparently, just down the road from the facility, a woman's house had been broken into that same night. She had been attacked in her bed by a man, a drug seeker, who had ransacked her home, searching for medication. The description they gave of the suspect matched the man I had seen at the window, the one who had rung the doorbell 3 times, the one who had looked directly into my eyes before fleeing. The realization hit me hard. I had come so close to being in real danger, alone in that facility with 15 vulnerable residents depending on me. The man hadn't gotten inside, but the thought of what could have happened if he had sent a cold shiver down my spine. Even now, thinking back on that night fills me with a deep sense of dread, a reminder that sometimes the dangers we fear the most are closer than we realize. It was a routine night at the pub, one that I had done countless times before. My shift ended around 11 p.m., and after a couple of drinks with coworkers, I decided it was time to head home. The pub was about 2 miles from my house, and while the walk wasn't ideal, I'd gotten used to it. It was a straight shot down a rural road, familiar to me from many late-night walks. That night, however, had an eerie feel to it. The sky was overcast, and the new moon left the world in near total darkness. There was no natural light, and since I lived in the boonies, there wasn't much light pollution either. It was just me and the blackness, with the only source of light being a single streetlight about a quarter mile from the pub. Once I passed that, the rest of the journey would be in complete darkness. That night had been particularly good for me, tips-wise, and I was carrying close to $400 in cash. It was a nice reward after a long shift, and I had stuffed the bills into my pockets before heading out. I felt the slight thrill of having that much cash on me, but I wasn't too concerned. After all, I had done this walk so many times that it felt routine, almost automatic. As soon as I stepped out of the pub, the night seemed to swallow me whole. The quiet was overwhelming. No cars, no people, just the faint rustling of leaves in the cool night air. The road ahead stretched into darkness, the streetlight in the distance glowing like a tiny beacon, the only thing separating me from a world of shadows. My footsteps seemed louder than usual on the pavement, each one echoing back at me as I made my way down the road. Despite the familiarity, something felt off. There was a heaviness in the air that I couldn't quite shake, a creeping sense of unease that gnawed at the back of my mind. I kept walking, trying to push the feeling aside, telling myself it was just the darkness playing tricks on me. After all, this wasn't the first time I'd walked home alone at night. But the night felt different this time, more oppressive, as if the blackness around me was hiding something just out of sight. I quickened my pace as I neared the single streetlight. Once I passed it, I knew I'd be plunged into the pitch-black darkness for the rest of the walk. Just as I was nearing the pool of light from the street lamp, I heard the sound of a car approaching from behind. Its headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the road around me for a brief moment. I instinctively stepped to the side of the road, giving the car room to pass. But instead of speeding by, the car slowed as it came alongside me, crawling at an unnervingly slow pace. My heart gave a slight jump, but I tried to brush it off. Maybe they were just lost or curious about why someone was walking this late. After a few moments, the car sped up again and drove ahead, disappearing into the night. It wasn't until the car slowed to a stop about a quarter mile down the road that my sense of unease transformed into full-blown dread. There it was, just sitting in the middle of the road, not moving, not turning off its engine, just parked as if waiting. I stopped walking, frozen for a moment as I watched. The car didn't move. It was as if the driver was watching me, waiting for something. The pit in my stomach deepened as the seconds dragged on, the oppressive darkness closing in on all sides. Finally, after what felt like forever, the car slowly started moving again, driving away into the night. I exhaled a shaky breath and tried to convince myself that everything was fine. It was just a random car, nothing to worry about. But as I stepped back onto the road and resumed walking, the sense of being watched lingered in the air, a thick, invisible presence following me as I made my way deeper into the darkness. As I continued down the dark road, trying to shake the growing sense of dread, I couldn't stop thinking about the car that had stopped ahead of me. The darkness made it difficult to judge the distance, but it was far enough away that I tried to convince myself it wasn't a threat. Maybe the driver had pulled over for a phone call, or maybe they had gotten lost. I clung to these rationalizations, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Just as I began to calm my nerves, the sound of an engine reached my ears again, this time from behind. My stomach twisted as I realized it was the same car, slowly creeping toward me from the opposite direction. The headlights cut through the darkness once more, illuminating the road in a stark, unsettling contrast of light and shadow. My footsteps slowed as the car passed me, moving at an unnervingly slow pace, as if the driver was studying me. I kept my head down, trying to act like I hadn't noticed, but my heart was racing, and I could feel my palms starting to sweat. The car passed, but only by a little. I glanced back just in time to see it stop again, just down the road. This time, a cold wave of fear crashed over me, much stronger than before. The car had no reason to stop again. The road was completely empty. No side streets, no reason for anyone to pull over, especially not in the middle of the night. It was as if the driver was toying with me, letting me know they were watching. I stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do next. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Could they be following me? Were they waiting for me to get closer before doing something? There was no way to be sure, but every instinct in my body screamed that I was in danger. I glanced back at the pub, now too far to see, knowing there was no safe retreat. If I tried to run back, they would easily intercept me, and the thought of being trapped on this dark, empty road with nowhere to go sent a shiver down my spine. I started walking again, faster this time, my footsteps almost breaking into a jog. I glanced back again to check the car's position, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The car had turned around, its headlights off. The only thing more terrifying than seeing the car creeping toward me was seeing it moving in complete darkness. Whoever was driving knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't an accident, and it certainly wasn't coincidence. My fear turned to panic. There was no way to tell how close they were without the lights to guide me, but the silence of the car creeping forward made me feel like I was being hunted. I couldn't keep walking down the road. There was nowhere to hide in the open, and if they were after me, they would catch up in no time. The darkness, once a familiar part of my nightly walk, had now become my enemy, concealing my potential pursuers and leaving me vulnerable. My only choice was to run into the woods. Without thinking, I darted off the road, plunging into the thick trees and undergrowth that bordered the street. The sound of branches snapping under my shoes seemed deafening in the stillness, but I didn't stop until I was deep enough into the woods that the road was barely visible through the dense foliage. My breath came fast and heavy, my heart pounding in my ears as I crouched low, hiding behind a bush. I tried to steady my breathing, but the adrenaline coursing through my veins made it impossible to calm down. Every nerve in my body was on edge, ready to react to the slightest sound. I stared toward the road, trying to see any movement, but the darkness was suffocating. The trees and bushes blocked my view, and without the car's headlights, I couldn't see anything. My senses were heightened, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig sending a fresh surge of fear through me. The silence felt unnatural now, too thick, as if the night itself was holding its breath. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of car doors opening and closing. My heart nearly stopped. Someone had gotten out of the car, and they were close. My mind raced, imagining the worst. I pressed myself harder against the ground, trying to make myself as small and invisible as possible. The dark woods offered some cover, but I knew it wouldn't be enough if they decided to come looking for me. Minutes dragged by like hours. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, drowning out everything else. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't get enough air. I kept imagining footsteps crunching through the undergrowth, a shadow creeping toward me, and a hand reaching out to grab me from behind. I was completely helpless, trapped in the pitch-black woods with no way to escape, no way to defend myself, and no way to call for help. Suddenly, I heard car doors again, followed by the low hum of an engine starting. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound of tires crunching against the gravel road filled the air, growing fainter and fainter as the car drove away. I stayed frozen, afraid to move, unsure if the danger had truly passed. Time seemed to slow to a crawl as I waited, every muscle in my body tensed, expecting something to happen. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I risked a glance back at the road. There was nothing, no car, no movement, just the eerie stillness of the night. I stayed crouched in the woods for what felt like hours, though it was likely only a few minutes. The darkness around me was suffocating, the thick branches and undergrowth providing cover, but also making me feel trapped. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, and every creak of the trees or rustle of leaves had my body on high alert, terrified that someone was approaching. I couldn't see anything, but the sound of those car doors opening and closing was burned into my mind. Someone had gotten out of that car, and I was sure they were looking for me. The eerie stillness of the woods only heightened my panic. The blackness was oppressive, and I couldn't see the road anymore. For all I knew, they were standing just a few feet away, silently scanning the area, waiting for me to make a sound. The idea of someone creeping through the darkness, hunting me in silence, sent shivers down my spine. I fought to stay as still as possible, barely breathing, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I huddled behind the bush. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the unmistakable sound of the car doors closing again, louder this time, followed by the low rumble of the engine starting up. I still couldn't see the car, but I could hear the tires crunching slowly over the gravel road, moving away from where I was hiding. I wanted to believe it was over, that they had given up and were leaving, but my body refused to relax. Something about the whole situation still felt wrong. I waited, motionless, long after the sound of the car had faded into the distance. My mind raced with terrifying possibilities. What if they were trying to trick me into thinking they had left? What if they had parked further up the road, waiting for me to come out of hiding? I felt paralyzed, torn between the urge to bolt back to the safety of the pub and the overwhelming fear that someone was still out there, watching me. Minutes passed, though time felt like it had lost all meaning. The quiet of the woods had returned, but instead of being comforting, it felt eerie and unnatural. I strained to hear any sound, footsteps, voices, anything that would indicate the person had left, or worse, was still nearby. But the night remained stubbornly silent. My breathing, shallow and quick, was the only thing I could hear, mixing with the pounding of my heart in my ears. Eventually, when the silence felt unbearable, I made the decision to move. I couldn't stay hidden in the woods all night. Every second out here alone made me feel more vulnerable, like the darkness itself was closing in on me. Slowly, I crawled out from behind the bush, every movement careful and deliberate, my body on high alert for any sound or movement. My hands brushed against the cold, damp earth, and my legs felt stiff from crouching for so long. I peered through the trees, my heart still racing, but the road looked empty. There were no headlights, no movement, just the silent stretch of asphalt vanishing into the blackness on either side. For a moment I hesitated, wondering if I should wait longer, but the thought of staying out in the woods any longer made my skin crawl. I needed to get back to the pub. Cautiously, I crept toward the edge of the trees, scanning the area as I moved. My every step felt agonizingly slow, my ears straining to pick up any sign of the car returning. Finally, when I reached the side of the road, I paused, crouching low as I checked for any signs of life. The road was eerily still, bathed only in darkness and shadows. Deciding I couldn't wait any longer, I bolted. I ran as fast as I could, my feet pounding against the pavement, the cold night air biting at my face. My lungs burned with each breath, but I didn't dare slow down. I kept my eyes on the horizon, praying I would make it back to the pub before the car, or whoever was in it, returned. My legs felt like they were moving on autopilot, driven by sheer adrenaline and fear. The pub's dim lights finally came into view, and relief washed over me. But I didn't stop running until I was inside, the door slamming behind me. My boss, who had just finished closing up, looked up in surprise as I stumbled in, breathless and shaking. Words spilled out of me in a frantic rush as I told him what had happened, my voice trembling with lingering fear. As soon as he heard my story, his face grew serious. Without hesitation, he made it clear. From that night on, I was never to walk home alone again. Either he, his brother, or his mom would give me a lift, no questions asked. The other servers and kitchen staff, upon hearing what had happened, echoed his sentiment. They all agreed I should never walk alone at night, not after that. The gravity of the situation hit me then. The car had clearly been following me, waiting, watching. Whether they had seen the cash I was carrying or had more sinister motives, I didn't want to know. The thought of what could have happened if I hadn't hidden in the woods haunted me. I knew I had been lucky, far too lucky, and from that night on, I made sure I was never alone on that dark road again.